Independent. Now though on BBC Radio 4, The Eureka Years, presented by Adam Hart-Davis.
Hello and welcome to the 6th century BC, a time of astonishing scientific and philosophical achievement. It's a century of ideas that gives us the Buddha, Confucius, Zoroaster and the early Greek poets, philosophers, scientists and writers. Nebuchadnezzar II builds the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The anatomist Alcmaeon of Croton discovers the difference between veins and arteries. Anaximander teaches that all life develops from amphibians. And the Babylonian lunar year has 354 days, not far out. But our story begins inside a mountain on the Greek island of Samos. Samos is the most easterly of the Greek islands. Within swimming distance is Turkey, the coastal fringe of which was then Ionia. The main city on the island was also called Samos, and in 550 BC had a population of some 20,000. It lay on the southeast side of the island, where today is the modest town renamed Pythagoreon. Ever since the time of Calaios, who around 640 BC discovered the silver mines of Spain, the Samians had been rich. And in the following century, they got richer on the passing trade. Samos was one of the crossroads of the ancient world and the perfect place for plunder and piracy, ably carried on by the ruthless tyrant Polycrates. Not surprisingly, they had built their city walls high. But they had a problem. The city's only constant supply of fresh water came from a spring which bubbles up out of the ground on the other side of this mountain, Mount Castro. The engineer Eupalinos of Megara reckoned they should tunnel through the mountain to ensure a secure supply. He calculated the best place and direction on the north side of the mountain, slightly downhill from the spring, and in about 550 BC, they started digging.
Eupalinos' tunnel is a fascinating example of what could be done technologically.
Classicist Dr. Peter Jones.
Two teams of workers, beginning from either side of Mount Castro on the island of Samos, dig a tunnel nearly 2/3 of a mile long, 8 foot by 8 foot in cross-section, so accurately from both sides that with minimum deviation they meet in the middle. And one of the problems is that Eupalinos did not build the tunnel sloping to any serious extent. There's a minimum incline from outside the city to inside the city. So what he did was to build the tunnel first, and then inside that he built a piped inclining channel, which in parts of the places actually had to be dug into the floor, and that provided enough of a slope for him to bring the water inside.
But it was a huge effort, wasn't it, digging that ditch along the side of the existing tunnel?
It certainly was an enormous effort, but how much greater an effort it would have been trying to build a slope into a tunnel started from both ends of a mountain, which had never been done before.
Eupalinos' problem was that after a year or so, Samos was threatened by Persian enemies, and Eupalinos decided to speed up the tunnelling process. But if he set more men to work beside those already in the tunnel, they would cut a wider tunnel, but they wouldn't go forward any faster. The only way to complete the tunnel more quickly was to dig at the same time from the other side of the mountain. This raised a triple problem. How high up the mountain should they go? Where should they start? And in which direction should they dig? They found the answers with the application of pure geometry, although exactly how is still not known. Amazingly, after some 5 years of digging, the two tunnels did meet in the middle of the mountain. Sadly, this water may well have come too late for a lad called Pythagoras, who was born on Samos about 570 BC, but probably left the island a few years before the tunnel was built, although the southern city, Pythagoreon, is now named after him. He sailed off to southern Italy and set up a marvellous mystical mathematical college or brotherhood at Croton, under the instep of Italy's foot. But what do we really know about Pythagoras? Peter Jones again.
The problem with Pythagoras is that we know him mainly as a religious cult leader who went to South Italy and set up a cult school there with initiation rituals, with doctrines, with password, with dietary restrictions. And it's looking more and more as if, because part of the doctrines which he established were to do with number, rabid disciples of his, hundreds of years after his death, retrojected all sorts of mathematical theories onto him and made him a master of mathematics and a master of music. But I mean, let's pretend, for the sake of the argument, that the famous Pythagoras theorem should indeed be assigned to Pythagoras. I mean, the really important thing about that is that Babylonians, and Babylon is near Baghdad in modern Iraq, of course, Babylonians had known about the regularity which Pythagoras knew about. In other words, they knew that the square on the hypotenuse was equal to the sum of the square on the other two sides. So the question to ask is, what's the big deal about Pythagoras? Now, the big deal about Pythagoras was that he proved that it must always be the case. In other words, he turned it into a demonstrated theorem. It had become an absolute certainty. And that, of course, is a huge intellectual leap, and something the Greek mathematicians were enormously good at.
Tell me about his wonderful brotherhood, or whatever it was, at Crotona.
We don't know a great deal about the detail or exactly how the whole thing worked. All we have are comments by stray... See, Pythagoras never wrote anything. All we have, therefore, are comments by people, hundreds of years after the event about the sort of thing that went on there.
Right.
But he was a mystic. He was a seer who set up this cult school in South Italy. And we know that there were dietary restrictions. For example, he was a vegetarian because he believed that you should not shed blood. And the reason why he believed that you shouldn't shed blood is because his central doctrine was the transmigration of souls in the afterlife, when men could return again as other creatures.
Right.
And there's a famous story of Pythagoras stopping someone beating a dog because he recognized the voice of a friend. And that's why Pythagoras' religious beliefs are mysterious and very controversial, because, of course, if you aren't allowed to spill blood, then, of course, you aren't allowed to sacrifice to the gods.
Couldn't you sacrifice a pile of broad beans or something?
Oh, it was perfectly possible to make other sorts of sacrifice. And indeed, Greeks did this every day. I mean, if you wanted to make a sacrifice to the god, the word sacrifice means to make something sacred. And that means to take something out of everyday human use and devote it over to divine use. And consequently, just putting a cake or a bun or a bean on an altar and leaving it there to rot away for the god's use, not for your use, was an adequate sacrifice. But the point is that blood sacrifice was the big one. And not to be able to do that would, I think, seem to a lot of people to be endangering your potential relationship with the gods.
What other sorts of restrictions were there?
Well, there was one famous restriction that you mustn't eat beans. And there's a belief that beans look too much like testicles, and eating testicles was not thought to be a good thing. So that was another sort of restriction. But you can see how we're groping to know actually what went on, because we just don't have a full or a sort of logical account of what went on in Pythagoras' mystery world.
Oh, delicious. Welcome to my bathroom. You join me as I attempt an experiment first used by a contemporary of Pythagoras called Empedocles, who lived on the island of Sicily among the stunning Greek temples at Agrigento. He was the chap who suggested that everything was made from just 4 elements: earth, air, fire and water, in varying proportions. Aristotle used this idea to help explain the behaviour of things. They all want to get home to where they belong. So, drop a stone and it falls to earth, because it belongs there. Blow bubbles in water and they rise to the air above. Flames burn upwards because the fire wants to get to the sun, and so on. Logical, but complete rubbish. Still, Empedocles did have a few good ideas, like the experiment he used to demonstrate that air isn't nothing. What he did was to take a bucket, like this one here, and go down to the seashore, and he plunged it upside down into the sea till it was right under the water, like this. And then, still holding it upside down, he very carefully took it out again and looked inside and showed that it wasn't wet all the way up inside. It's still dry at the bottom because the air was a real thing. It had kept the water out. So air wasn't nothing, it was something real, even though you couldn't see it or smell it or anything. The juiciest story of his death goes that he wanted to demonstrate that he was immortal. So he took all his followers up to the mighty volcano Mount Etna and jumped into the smoking crater. He was never seen again, But we remember him to this day, so in a sense, he did indeed make himself immortal. Like Pythagoras, Empedocles also went for the idea of transmigration of souls, and on a more practical level, he believed in some sort of evolutionary process, arguing that some creatures, less well adapted to survive on Earth, or indeed in the water, must have died off sometime in the past. This was a part of one of those big questions that seemed to bother the ancient Greeks. Where do we come from? Another philosopher struggling with this one was called Anaximander. He was born in Miletus, a very prosperous city with Persia to the east and Greece to the west, a crossroads where lots of different ideas passed through and met. Anaximander is now credited with many imaginative scientific speculations. He said that the universe is a boundless infinite.
He gave a history of our cosmos, how it began, where it came from. He gave, as part of that, an account of how different species of animals arose, which didn't make any reference to the kind of divinities that you get being talked about in earlier accounts of this sort. So you don't get anthropomorphic deities who sometimes quarrel, they sometimes fall in love, they have children, and this is how you explain how the world came to be. Rather, Anaximander is interested in explaining the world according to the workings of some very basic natural processes like drying, cooling, getting wet, getting hot.
Classicist James Warren from Cambridge University.
There is this boundless infinite that makes up the universe. But within it there are heavens, and within each heaven there seems to be a world, a cosmos. And the Greek word cosmos that we've adopted to mean, a cosmos, means also an ordering. So it's an ordered system. Our cosmos arises out of this boundless infinite stuff. And it begins with very basic elements. Some evidence says that he thought it was earth, air, fire and water. Some evidence says he thought it were things you might call the opposites, hot, cold, wet, dry. The cosmos, it seems, begins to be formed when the heavenly bodies, especially the sun, begins to dry out the moisture at the centre. And this drying out is what then creates the differentiation between earth and sea. The next step is, I think, what's very interesting, is that he sees the development of animal kinds just as a further step in that very same process. And then humans, fully formed adult humans, emerge out of fish or fish-like animals. Now, of course, this is a pretty crazy story in lots of ways, but I think what's important to note is the sort of explanation that he's interested in giving. He doesn't want to use any divine intervention to describe how humans arose. He's very happy thinking of humans as part of a series of natural developments that include things like fish, but at the very beginning include the basic processes that separate the earth from the land.
I think it's very significant that philosophy is invented by Greeks living on the coast of Ionia, which is our western Turkey. Greeks are in contact with the Near East. Now, all sorts of interesting things are going on in the Near East. I mean, we've talked about the Babylonians of mathematics and astronomy, for example. There's a real mishmash here. There's a hotbed of ideas. The second and most important thing is that Greeks are a very Bolshevik, independent-minded lot anyway. And the most important thing about Greek society, I think, is that there was no ruling caste of priests or magicians to tell them what to think, in other words, to impose dogma upon them. The contrast with Egypt, for example, would be very strong here. Again, writing had just become widespread in this part of the world, so they could pen their thoughts and share them with others, and argue with others. Greek loved arguments, and when you throw in the final brick in this structure, the development of Greek democracy, it's the people who make decisions, and every proposal is up for grabs. Everything is there to be argued over. There are no authorities telling you what to think and what to do, and that's what's happening in the cultural world of the 6th century BC. It's an enormously exciting time to be alive.
If the organised chaos of ancient Greece was inspiring great leaps forward, on the other side of the planet, one man's world was collapsing, and he began looking for any way forward. He found it in the past. Kung Fu-tse, or Confucius, was born in 551 BC into an aristocratic but impoverished family. After a career as a local government official, he started his search for enlightenment, wandering the countryside with a small band of disciples and preaching his own brand of philosophy. Christopher Cullen is the director of the Needham Institute in Cambridge. For him, Confucius was looking for some order from the chaos around him.
He saw the world he was living in as one in which all the old certainties were collapsing. For instance, the feudal states were all supposed to be bound together by their loyalty to the High King of the state of Zhou, which had been the founder of the families from which the rulers of these states came. However, they were in fact increasingly at war with one another. They did not obey the High King of Zhou. So what Confucius set out to do was to say, how in the increasing moral and political chaos of our day can I find some guide from the past for the future? He took what was originally just an aristocratic code of conduct, a code of honour, of doing your duty in the face of all danger, die at your post if necessary, stick to what your family has always done, and he transformed this into something that was, in a sense, socially and politically portable, by saying there is a content to this ancient morality which is not just limited to aristocrats, but which can be practiced by anybody. And this morality is the moral code that is essentially natural to human beings, that is in tune with the way the cosmos works, and therefore will work if only people will practice it. Going against this code will simply mean the machine will conk out.
In his lifetime, Confucius wasn't all that important. Even in the centuries after his death, there were hundreds of teachers and little schools of thought, some advocating the pursuit of pleasure, others the need for usefulness rather than ritual. In fact, whatever your poison, you could find a school to suit. But this freedom and variety didn't last.
This was brought to an abrupt halt by the unification of China under the Qin Empire at the end of the 3rd century BC. The first emperor of Qin was the one with the pottery warriors, the hero of that film, Hero, which actually celebrates the complete crushing of the independence of the Chinese feudal states and the elimination of their culture in favour of one huge empire responsible to one man. The first emperor of Qin would only allow one single school of thought to be propagated under his kingdom. That was the one that was later called the Fajia, which means literally the school of laws, which basically held that what you should do in society was, well, whatever gave the ruler, who was the advocate of this, of course, as much power as possible. The Qin Empire did not last very long, but it certainly dealt a great blow to the so-called 100 schools of thought which had been contending freely all over the feudal states of China before that time. When the Qin Empire was replaced by the Han Dynasty, which basically lasted from about 200 BC to 200 AD, a long-lived and settled dynasty, you can say intellectuals staggered into the beginning of the Han Dynasty in a certain rather dazed and battered sense. But when we get into the 2nd century BC, we begin to find the Han emperors casting around for something that's going to give them a more stable way of controlling people, other than saying, if you do the wrong thing, your head will be cut off. If you do the right thing, I'll give you a lot of money and promote you. They wanted a way to co-opt the literati class of China into supporting the imperial government in a way that would not require continual repression. And it was at that point that the choice was taken to promote the Confucian tradition, which was the one followed still, I think, by a majority of the literati in China at that time, and to make that the official ideological tradition of the state. And there are plenty of people in modern Beijing who send their children to classes to learn how to chant Confucian classics, and who would say that Confucius is certainly a basic teacher for everyone who wants to understand how Chinese society works, and how indeed much of East Asian society works, including Korea and Japan.
Confucius doesn't really have a Western equivalent. no one has come to dominate the history of Western philosophy in quite the same way, but some have come close. One of the candidates is a contemporary of Pythagoras and perhaps a mentor to Anaximander. His name was Thales of Miletus, the first of all the philosophers. Peter Jones again.
He's the first card-carrying Western intellectual, perhaps we should call him encyclopedia-carrying, I don't know, and is credited with inventing what we call philosophy in about 580 BC. In other words, he's the first person we know of to ask questions like, what's the world made of? How did it all begin? And, vitally important, to try to use human reason supported by argument and evidence to come to a conclusion. In other words, and this is the vital negative point, your answer could not involve the supernatural. You're not allowed to say the gods are the answer. Now, no one to our knowledge before Thales had done that. No one had replaced assertion and dogma with argument and logic. And this is why Thales is so enormously important. And the point is that everyday Greeks mocked him endlessly for it. There are all these wonderful stories about him being so busy gazing up at and thinking about the stars that he fell down a well. People demanded to know why, if he was so clever he wasn't filthy rich, and so on. In other words, from the very beginning, intellectuals are seen as impractical dreamers. And that image of them, of course, has continued right down to the modern world.
He's the very first Greek philosopher. Science is born with Thales. He's the first person we know about to start thinking and asking questions about the world, the cosmos, why things are the way they are, where they came from, where we came from, how did life form on the planet.
Tracy Rill from the University of Swansea.
Thales is a very important figure, but unfortunately, because he's so early, there is so little firm evidence about him. We do have stories. One is about him predicting a good harvest for olives. This arises in the context of somebody saying the equivalent of, well, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And him then using his intelligence to forecast that it's going to be a bumper year in the olive harvest, to rent all the local olive mills so that when the olive farmers bring their crop for pressing, he can make a tidy profit on it and thereby use his intelligence to make himself rich. But I think the idea of ancient scientists living in ivory towers is very much overblown. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of them were very practical. They didn't need to be landed, leisured elite in order to be able to spend time doing things like mathematics. People generally worked a lot less hard than we do today. They valued their leisure a lot more highly. They would do as much work as necessary to survive.
For those interested in competition, the place to be was Delphi. Before the 6th century, you could enjoy a very nice vocal performance and some strumming of the kithara. This was a stringed instrument, usually with 7 strings and no fingerboard, so there was just one note per string. All the same, very good for plucking a dainty tune and warbling a song. But in 586 BC, the festival at Delphi was expanded and new musical contests were introduced, and massively influential was the contest for the solo pipe player. A favourite piece for the competition was the Pithekos Knomos, a song without words or tone poem of 5 movements depicting Apollo's victory over a giant serpent. Up to now, the pipes were strictly for fun, weddings and birthdays, that sort of thing. But as Andrew Barker, an expert in ancient music, explains, all that was about to change.
This is simply something that jumps into view in 586 BC and then takes off. It was a huge success. The same performer who played it in 586 BC won the competition on 2 subsequent occasions. The person who followed him on the 4th occasion of this competition at Delphi, in fact, won it 6 times in a row. So there were obviously specialists, mostly from the region of Argos. These performances were always set in a competitive context, and I think that that's something which helped to drive the improvements in technique. People wanted to win, so they polished up their techniques. They tried to be more spectacular than the one before. So you get a well-known divide between, on the one hand, the auloi with their emotive, ecstatic sound, which were thought of as belonging to the province of Dionysus, And the stringed instruments, plucked stringed instruments, on the other hand, which were thought of as belonging to the god of purity and truth, and not emotion, Apollo. We know that it's an instrument with a great deal of potential for colour, for drama, for extensive range of pitch, for shadings of pitches and so on. There's a lot you can do with the pipes. Whereas if you've got a set of fixed strings, which can't be adjusted while you're playing, and you've only got maybe 7 of them, there are obviously considerable limits to what you can do in the way of dramatic coloration. The pipes seem to have dragged other musicians by the nose, as it were, and they were very, very attracted towards the kind of drama that you could create on the pipes.
Greeks love ideas and they love new ideas. They have no respect for their intellectual elders and betters. It's been said that if Greeks stood on the shoulders of giants who lived before them, they very soon kicked them in the head and threw them down on the ground again, because they believed that they could do better. Greeks, in other words, are very competitive people.
There's no established organisational educational system. It takes a rather long time for schools to get going. Schools are starting off about the time that the Parthenon is being built. They're private, there's no government control of them other than that they mustn't open before dawn, they must shut before sunset. There's no national curriculum, there's no qualifications at the end of it. So there's no control really on what people think, what they should think. There's religion, but belief doesn't matter. You don't have to believe in the gods. You might upset them if you don't follow the rituals, or if you deliberately flout a particular god, then most people would probably think you'll get your comeuppance in due course, and the gods will take it. Occasionally with things like murder, that pollutes the whole community. The gods might take vengeance on the entire state if this is not sorted. They develop the law courts and the jury, trial by jury. It all coheres. The same sort of attitudes of mind that lead to the development of science also lead to the development of democracy. I mean, the Greeks are very different to the societies that have gone before. In some sense, it's a Greek miracle.
The Eureka Years was presented by Adam Hart-Davis and produced in Bristol by John Byrne. In a new series starting next week on BBC Radio 4, the comedian Marcus Brigstock tears down the louver doors and rips up the laminate flooring to reveal the real history of the British housing market. He starts by surveying, literally, the land itself.
So, once I'd surveyed the whole of Cambridgeshire with a length of chain and some arrows, and the sheep had explained the finer points of the altazimuth theodolite, I began to wonder who actually owns that land, and the other millions of acres that make up the UK.
And the answer to that question turns out to be rather surprising. Marcus Brigstock's As Safe as Houses begins next Saturday morning at 10:30. After the news, Steve Richards considers the week in Westminster.